In the history of art, over probably thousands and thousands of years, there are very few subjects that have received as much reinterpretation as Jesus himself. Jesus' crucifixion in particular has probably hundreds, if not more, well-known depictions. Some depict him having more European features, while some show him looking more Jewish or Middle Eastern. Some depict him looking frail, worn down, highlighting his humanity. Others depict him triumphant, strong, highlighting his divinity. You've got pictures like The Lord's Supper by Leonardo da Vinci, showing him full of life before the crucifixion, surrounded by his disciples. Then you have the Pietà by Michelangelo, showing him after the crucifixion, showing him crushed, defeated, his body held in the arms of his mother. There are depictions of the crucifixion that are gruesome and realistic, others that are abstract and symbolic. So Thomas, I have a question for you. Have you ever seen a portrait of Jesus in a pretty dress?
No, I have not.
All right. Hey, everybody. Welcome.
I just have to say, this episode feels like when like your uncle shows up for Christmas and he's like, hey, in that box, there's a present for you. And he doesn't tell you what it is, and he just keeps chuckling to himself all night. It's literally been John. I have no idea what we're talking about right now.
I have tried to keep this story completely locked down because of that one reaction I wanted to get. But I know that you're really curious about the rest of this episode.
Oh, man.
All right.
Is this going to be are we going to call this the 2CV from hell? This episode?
Maybe.
Oh my gosh.
Maybe.
All right, hit me with it.
All right, so Thomas, this is the story of Wilgefortis, also known in some languages as Uncumber, also known in some languages as Liberata, also known as Ontkamer. And
I'm pretty sure you just said like 3 different languages. That was like Dutch, Latin American, and like German.
You're not. Those are all pretty accurate.
Okay.
So Wilgefortis was a folk saint, and honest to goodness, we could do a whole series about folk saints, because holy smokes. If you don't know what folk saints are, just keep listening. We're going to get into that and more. From the 14th century, Wilgefortis. So there's a very basic story that kind of goes along with this, and then there's even more behind that. So just bear with us, guys. So in the Middle Ages, there was a king in Portugal who was not a Christian. He was a pagan, and he had a young, beautiful teenage daughter. He, out of, looking for arrangements and political bargaining tools, offered to marry his beautiful young daughter to a Moorish king who was also a pagan. The problem was his daughter, beautifully named Wilgefortis, was a Christian, and Wilgefortis had devoted herself to chastity, to be a lifelong virgin. And so she pleads and pleads and pleads with her father that she would not be forced to marry this man, but he refuses. The night before the arrival of this king, who was to take her hand in marriage, Wilgefortis prays to God. And she says, God, would you make me so hideous that this man would no longer want to take me in marriage? Much to her surprise, when she woke up the next morning, she awoke with a face covered with a rich, full beard. I kind of imagine it's like that scene in The Santa Claus when Tim Allen shaves off his beard and he looks in the mirror and it just... And so when the pagan king arrived, he's horrified, and he refuses to marry this young woman. And the girl's father, knowing that some trickery had happened, was absolutely furious. And he decides that if she wants to be so committed to her Christian faith, then she should die like a Christian, and he has her crucified.
Whoa.
Yeah, really, really intense. So now, the story of Wilgefortis took a while to gain traction, but when the Catholics in Europe heard the tale of her martyrdom, her story spread like wildfire. And so from the 14th to 16th centuries, Wilgefortis was known as a folk saint. And what that means is essentially this is a saint who is not recognized by the Catholic Church, but they basically attract kind of a regional following because of certain heroics around their life. I think most folk saints are often martyrs too. And like I said, they're not recognized by the Catholic Church. And sometimes they, which was the case of Wilgefortis, literally gain what's called cult status, where people start to venerate them and pray to them, which the Catholic Church as a whole would not condone. But that happens. It happened with Wilgefortis, and it's happened with a number of what are called folk saints. And so she gained this massive following in the 14th century in Europe, and people believed that a big part of her following being so massive was because she was seen as this like hero, specifically to women who were in unwanted or abusive marriages, because she was seen as someone who weaponized her looks rather than lose her ability to show devotion to God through her chastity. So she was seen by and large as a hero, and literally had a cult dedicated to her. And this cult, according to some sources, was really only rivaled by the cult of the Virgin Mary herself.
Whoa.
So it was massive in terms of following. And there's a lot of artistic portrayals of sweet Wilgefortis.
Okay, can I Google it now? Because I've like held off like looking this up.
Please
Okay.
do. Yeah. We could take a break in the story. I just want you to tell me, like, it is kind of like, I mean, it's a bearded woman. Like it's kind of looks like a circus attraction a little bit.
Straight up,
it's kind of interesting.
Some like very traditional looking iconography. It's like at first glance, it's like, oh, is it the Virgin Mary? Oh, is it Nope.
No,
it's Wilgefortis.
It's Wilgefortis. Yep. Yeah, and she's often portrayed in a very, very pretty dress. And oftentimes some jewelry with like head adornment, and she's just sporting a full beard.
Wow.
Yeah, it's kind of wild.
Okay, so did this movement kind of like phase out after a while, or is it still going today?
No, it phased out. It's so around the 16th century, her little following started to kind of lose traction. I saw some sources kind of connect it to the Reformation, weirdly enough. I think
the guys were like, hold up. I was like, that's when they opened their eyes. They were like, okay.
They were like, it's
time to buckle down.
I think we need to start reconsidering a few things.
Oh my gosh.
So yeah, there were some interesting things there, but apparently, legitimately, during the Reformation, the idea of sainthood, I think it was so widely criticized by the reformers that there was actually kind of the approach to the saints and all that was shifting. And so, but Wilgefortis was never officially canonized by the church. She did get a feast day, which I'm not quite sure how that kind of comes about. Maybe that's more of like a popular election type thing. I don't know. But so I'm sure you're wondering, if you're listening to this story, so what does this have to do with Jesus in a dress? Well, this is where the story gets a little more interesting. So in the 8th century, in the 700s, this sculpture arrived in Italy that was called the Volto Santo, and this was a life-size sculpture of Jesus being crucified. And if you looked at it today, which it still exists in, I think, the Cathedral of San Martino in Lucca, Italy, it doesn't have a lot of the same markings of a traditional crucifixion piece. Also, another weird thing about this story was that it's attributed to Nicodemus, the Pharisee from the Old Testament. They believed that he sculpted it, and then I guess they just lost it for like 700 years, and then they found it and wheeled it over to Italy.
Up.
Yeah. I think it was even one of those pieces where, like, about the Shroud of Turin.
Mm-hmm.
It's kind of like it wasn't really sculpted by Nicodemus. It was attributed to him, but basically he like woke up and it was done.
Right.
Like
okay.
it was one of those pieces of art that like God did himself, which is
not our jam.
Yeah,
but,
that's an interesting. Yeah, that's an interesting flavor of jam. You know, yeah, that's a strawberry for me. I'm more of a grape guy myself, and so. Again, it's unique in how it's portrayed, and one of the things is that it's life size. Most portrayals of the crucifixion were not life size. This one depicts Jesus wearing a very ornate looking crown, which most of the time a lot of the people who depicted Jesus' crucifixion opted to go more like literal, but the big thing was that it featured Jesus wearing a long flowing garment. Whereas when you think of most pictures of Jesus being crucified, he's usually just wearing a loincloth. And this one, he's wearing a long garment. The reason for that was because it's believed historically that this was done by Eastern artists. And in the Eastern tradition of Christianity and the Byzantine side, well, it wasn't just that. It's that Jesus was highlighted to be our high priest. And
so it's like a priest's garment?
Exactly.
Okay.
They wanted to give him a priest's garb that you would find in, say, the Old Testament. And so they dressed him up like a priest and they put him on the cross. And so the connection here is that around the time that the story of Wilgefortis really popped up in Europe, the story goes that a group of traveling pilgrims made their way to Lucca, Italy, saw this sculpture and thought, huh? Jesus is wearing a dress. And so they were like, Jesus is not wearing a dress. This must be someone else. And this is kind of where this like folk story came. Because here's the real interesting part. There is nothing in the historical records that can confirm that this woman ever existed, like at all.
Right.
And
it's
so
just all just
we think it was made up. Yeah. Like I think there was a story of a woman.
So all of this was like in response to them finding this statue?
Yep.
Like they just made up this story about
Jesus
a bearded
in a dress,
woman?
and they were like, "We've got like this must be connected to something else." And
all the pieces are falling into place.
That's why it's so strange. And like, and to be fair, there are some sources that say that they're in medieval Portuguese history, there was something about a king who had a daughter who was crucified because she refused to marry some so-and-so. I don't think there's any record that affirms that she was, woke up fully bearded one day. And there's also a lot of criticism that like, this is just not likely to happen. The story doesn't really fit historical context very well. And I think to add insult to injury, in 1969, which is around the time of Vatican II, which the Catholic Church was making a lot of very serious reforms, they actually removed like over 100 feast days to saints that they couldn't historically affirm, and one of them was Wilgefortis.
Wow.
And they claimed that two big reasons why. One was that there was little to no evidence that this person ever existed, and the second was that speculation around her story was leading people to make unorthodox claims that the church would not affirm, namely that there were very progressive Christians coming from that kind of theologically left background who were trying to present her as a non-binary hero of the faith.
Oh, wow.
Which just goes to show that,
Which, when I looked this up, and I'm looking at the pictures,
right.
Like, I found this iPad case that you can buy. Santa Wilgefortis, and like it honestly, like if I didn't know this story, I would be like, what sort of like transgender
it
like unorthodox
Jesus.
Yeah, it looks really like in our cultural moment it's very off.
Right. Yeah. When you look at it without any context, and I'm just on Google Images scrolling right now. There are dozens of unique portraits, but it really does. It looks like someone creating an intentionally sacrilegious image of Jesus.
Yeah.
Because he's on the cross. He typically has the halo around his head, and he's just, wearing Aunt Myrtle's finest. So
What a conversation starter for an iPad case.
Yeah, it's interesting. But I think I just really loved the idea that this entire story was born out of somebody showing up at this like 700-year-old statue on a spiritual pilgrimage and just being like, what the heck is this?
Yeah, well, I feel like it could kind of be like an interesting example to use when we think about how some stories in church history seem to be reverse engineered, you know, where it's like we want as a desired outcome, so we're gonna like work the sin out of like a person's life retroactively or like something like that. Yeah. And or just make them cooler than they really were, which I think kind of sometimes contributes to the veneration of saints. If you make people more important than Jesus.
Yeah, I mean, like, what's interesting to me about this is like the concept of having a folk saint is so interesting, because it's like a saint is typically someone who is universally amongst the church, at least as amongst church authority, recognized as a person of great piety and closeness to God, and like that is someone who should be aspired to. But like a folk saint is just like, nah, we just really liked Jeffrey from our neighborhood who did this really cool thing for God. But the fact that like they were venerating her, like, I mean, just looking at the massive images that were reproduced in that time, like people really had a strong affinity for her. But it's like, one, she didn't exist. Two, the Catholic Church never really affirmed this kind of veneration to begin with. Like this just seems like maybe it's a reflection on the state of the church at that time. But like, I don't know. That's just so interesting. I mean, I guess Protestants don't really have much of a great track record for self-appointing our own people. We don't do it through veneration, but we will qualify leaders who often should not be qualified. And
that oftentimes comes from like us being somewhat decentralized. And a case can be made that at this point in Roman Catholic history, like the church is starting to kind of lose their centralized grasp on things. Sure. Like their influence is pretty wide, and to the degree that they were functioning like an empire, that's usually when empires lose their steam, is when things get just geographically it's too big out there. Like just can't keep track of everything.
And I think that was a big part of it, because, and I mean, what's interesting about this story is like, if there was historical backing to it, even minus the beard stuff, you know, the beard is like such a strange attention grabbing thing. But if there legitimately was a young woman who refused to be married to a pagan king, like I think that'd be a remarkable story. And I don't think it's bad that people latched on to this tale, aside from the fact that it was literally nothing more than an urban legend.
I mean, it almost has this sort of like Cinderella, Sleeping Beauty kind of quality to it. Like, I honestly was like, wait till Disney finds out about this. They'll run with it.
There's like it's like a...
Disney would have an unholy heyday with this story, by the way.
It's so interesting because, like, I mean, you could easily make this she didn't want to be made into an object, but ultimately, like, she had made a vow of chastity, and she wanted to fulfill that vow to God. And I think that's a great reason why. I mean, like, I watched a video of a gal who I think was from like the PCUSA, so a very, very progressive interpretation of the Bible. And even she was saying things where she's like, this was a woman who, real or fictitious, had like refused to be used as an object, refused to be dehumanized beyond the point that she was an image bearer of God, and like she was able to be a martyr that women can really like admire and respect. And I have nothing wrong with that statement, you know. There's nothing I can disagree with there. But yeah, it's just like, and I mean, I think it's evident in the fact that for 200 years there were people who were making portraits of this non-existent person.
I think this might be owing to just a quick little conversation about veneration of the saints. I was thinking about this earlier. So on the day that we're recording this, it's August 10th, which is the feast day for St. Lawrence, who we just did a podcast on a few weeks ago. And on our Instagram story today, we shared 2 different St. Lawrence things. And one of them was from a Catholic page and one was from an Anglican page.
Well, let's shout out our boy.
Oh
Ben
yeah.
Lansing,
Our Church Speaks. Yeah. The one was like some like rad trad, like goofy, like real. And then like Ben's post on Our Church Speaks was just very like, professional and faith inspiring per usual. But I noticed the difference between, for example, how Catholics and Anglicans talk about the saints. So like the one from the Catholic page ends with says like Saint Lawrence ora pro nobis, which is like pray for us. The Anglican page like talks about Lawrence, talks about what he does, and then ends with a traditional Anglican prayer, not to the saint, but to God. And it does a couple things. It like reminds God, and in that reminds us of like the work of that person, like thanks God for the work of Lawrence in history and for standing up against the authorities for the cause of justice or whatever the prayer was. And then the prayer goes in a direction that's like basically, oh God, make us like that, like instill in us by your word and by your spirit an ability to work through faith for the cause of whatever, that's kind of the traditional format. And I think that that's a really important distinction, especially when we're talking about saints. And if you're coming from like a Protestant point of view that may call into question whether you should even talk about saints at all. Like, isn't it just like, Jesus and only Jesus kind of thing? It's like, well, the saints, the family of faith is very, like impactful for us to like reflect on, not as this point or this like, this group of people that you should be praying to, because there's only one mediator between God and man, Jesus Christ. Which is
very traditional Protestant perspective, I would say.
Yeah. So yeah, there's just a kind of like a very subtle difference. It's subtle, but it's really critical.
Yeah. I mean, I think that what I admire about both the Catholic and the Orthodox view of the saints is it is an extension of their idea that we are all a part of one family of God.
Right.
And that God is very present and active with his people to do remarkable, beautiful, like restorative, redemptive things. And like even something like this, which was really just a brief act of courage that ended in a painful death, there is something very beautiful that like God gave a young woman who didn't exist. God gave a young woman the courage and the faith to in the face of death stand behind her conviction to live a life as a living sacrifice unto God.
Yeah.
And like that's really beautiful. And I do think there are plenty of people who for hundreds of years have affirmed the beauty of this story like in a good and healthy way. My fear about Protestants and how we approach this issue of saints is I think we get caught up in this idea of like, oh, well, I don't want to venerate, I don't want to worship a saint or anything like that. And it's like, dude, it's not so much about that as much as are you able to recognize the cloud of witnesses that we are a part of?
Yeah.
Like we've talked about this before, like this is one of the reasons why we started this podcast. Like we really want to urge Christians within every tradition that affirms Christ and him crucified, like to see yourself as part of a larger historic family of God.
Yeah.
That is rich and valuable. And I mean, and honestly, like shoot, like we can talk to some Catholics about the whole veneration idea. I don't vibe with it, neither does Tommy. We're both Reformed, like that should be no surprise to you guys. But ultimately it's like we do need to start to we do need to have that ability of zooming backwards and being able to see, oh, I'm not just like one dude in one church of like 50 people, and that's the kingdom of God in my eyes.
Yeah,
you know?
it reminds us of that concept that I think is Al Wolters, that idea of like what one generation suppresses, it's like a spring that the next generation, like it launches like way out of proportion. And so it's like, because you know, at one point in church history, or for a number of centuries now, we've had this unorthodox praying to saints. It's like now the rejection of that doesn't include thinking about the saints at all. It's like, no, like there's a healthy middle ground that we can go for. Yeah.
And I think Anglicans do a solid job with that.
Yeah.
And I think Lutherans probably do too.
Yeah.
But I don't care about them. So I'm not an Anglican or a Lutheran. But I do love it. And we gotta hit up our boy Ben to do another chat soon. That'd be a lot of fun.
Yeah, that would be fun.
Yeah.
Well, dude, thanks for bringing this. This was a total surprise topic for me.
Dude, I had like tears in my eyes earlier, bro. This is why we need to do a video podcast. But hey, I figured I'd throw it out there to you guys if you're still listening. Tommy and I want to do a Q&A episode pretty soon. We kind of teased it a little bit on our Instagram, which if you're not following, get on it. Church History, the number 4 and Chumps on Instagram. Yeah, we kind of pitched it to our Instagram followers, and everyone seemed to be kind of cool with the idea of us doing like a Q&A and kind of sharing some more about our life and our churches and maybe some church history questions. I don't know.
But what if I don't have Instagram?
I don't know. Then get it.
But don't we have a Gmail account?
Oh, we do. Yeah, I almost never check it.
Do you know what the domain is? Like, what's the account?
I think it's chumpfanmail@gmail.com. I'm gonna confirm that right now.
Plot twist, it's empty.
Dude, I'm gonna pull it up, and there's gonna be like 18 messages that we just haven't responded to. Like that dude from Australia who hit us up on Instagram, but I hadn't checked our message requests. So shout out to Andy from Down Under. Nothing else to say there.
Well, I thought you were pulling up our email account.
Oh, I did.
Okay,
yeah,
what's the email?
It is chumpfanmail@gmail.com.
Okay. Email us up if you're not on Insta, or you've got like a long form question, or you want to dialogue with us. Feel free to shoot us an email.
Yeah,
we'll collect questions over the next couple weeks, and then we'll do a fun Q&A pod coming up soon.
Absolutely, yeah, that'd be a lot of fun. And honestly, like what's your favorite church history story? That's fine, but like I want something hard hitting. You know?
Yeah, or maybe like if there's hit us with like if there's something in church history that confuses you, or that you feel like isn't right, or you feel like there's alternate views on, hit us up. We'll chump it up.
Yeah. We'll
subject it to the chump treatment.
Dude, there's so many chump puns we could be using.
Yeah.
Like white men can't chump. That'd be good.
That took me a second.
Yeah. The chump truck.
The chump truck. Yeah, dude.
The dump truck. All right. There's nothing else valuable happening in this recording. Thank you guys so much for listening. We will catch you guys later. And in North Las Vegas, we still see you out there. We appreciate you.
Yep.
And Ellen from Idaho too. I'm sorry there aren't more Idaho listeners.
Ellen's a real one. I'd say.
Ellen's the realest one. Yeah. And we could be talking about you like this if you were on our Instagram page. But for now, we're just going to talk about Ellen and how excited we are that her and her husband are both listening to our episodes. So, Ellen, God bless. And everyone else, God bless just a little bit less.
God bless you.
All right. Later, guys.